In this episode, I answer the question, what should I do with extra cash when I'm practicing infinite banking? I'm Nate. I make sense out of money. This is Dollars and Nonsense. If you follow the herd, you will be slaughtered. Well, I've come to find out that algorithms love when they see likes and reviews and ratings, and YouTube loves when you have lots of subscribers. And so I just thought I'd mention one more time as we start this episode too, that it would mean the world to us if you are enjoying this content, whether it's on YouTube or whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, if you would leave us a rating or a review or a subscribe. I just believe that infinite banking is such a huge impact in people's lives and for good that we really need to get the word out more and more, and especially for people who are doing it right. I believe we're doing it right. But with that, I want to dive in today. In this episode, I'm going to answer the question, what should I do with extra cash when I'm practicing infinite banking? I want to preface this. What I found out that a lot of people who do infinite banking submit videos with simple answers to complex questions. And it's so much deeper than what it sounds at surface value. And so I believe, fundamentally, point number one, I believe that every decision you make while you're practicing infinite banking is actually a logical decision. Now, my goal, if you become a client of mine, and so for all of the clients who are listening to this, my goal is to help you understand for yourself what to do in every situation that comes your way. Because honestly, every decision I believe that you make when practicing IBC is logical. Nelson Nash said this many times, if you know what's really going on, you'll know what to do. And if you're making a decision to start infinite banking, it's not always logical how to start because there's different stages you can start at, and depending on where you're at the time, that may be the best start. And so how you start, how much you put in, where you start, those things, there's some subjectivity to. But once you're in it, almost every decision becomes more and more logical. So the question of, we're going to talk about today is what should I do with extra cash? Like I'm starting a policy. I'm already doing policies. I have some policy loans out and I've got some extra cash sitting around. Nate, what should I do with this money while I'm doing it? It's a very common question. That answer is logical. Whenever you borrow money from your policy, how you repay it should be extremely logical. Like it should just make sense. In fact, I think we overcomplicate things. It should just make sense. The same thing goes as when should I start a new policy? Once again, it should be very logical. As time goes on, you should know for yourself how you're going to repay policy loans, when you're going to start new policies. Now, of course, we're here to help everyone who's starting out is going to have to learn the logic of IBC. So when should I start a new policy? It should make sense. How much premium should I be paying right now? Should make sense. All of these are supposed to be logical answers. So let's go ahead and dive in. One of the most common questions we get is this question of what should I do with extra cash? I cannot do it justice if I just give a simple answer to it without discussing the context so that you can learn the logic behind the answer. And so you can learn to think for yourself. That's actually the whole goal, that I want you to become what's called a type A infinite banker. That means that as you work with me and as you let me pour into you as a consultant, that you start to learn the thought process of why certain decisions are the way they are and why they're not. So we're going to talk about like a hypothetical scenario. And in that hypothetical scenario, this person's going to have extra cash. And I'm going to spend some time discussing the logic of this individual's hypothetical scenario. So I think it's going to be really fun. Let's dive in. So we're going to assume we have a guy or a family or something like that who's, making, good money, is paying premiums and is pretty committed to this infinite banking thing. And so maybe they're paying $100,000 a year into policy premiums to build up the bank. And remember, that could be a big number, that could be a small number. It really just depends on whoever. And we're going to make some assumptions. We're going to assume that he's already doing IBC. And then he's going to have a couple of policy loans outstanding in our little hypothetical scenario. We're going to say he's borrowed out $100,000 to finance a couple of cars. And we're also going to assume that he's pulled out $100,000 to make an investment in something. And one more thing to note about this guy is he's going to say, Nate, I've been paying my premiums. I'm paying back the loans that I've taken. You know what? And due to some sort of series of events, maybe he had a good year in business, maybe he had a windfall, an asset sold. He's saying, I'm also sitting on $100,000 in cash now that is not earmarked for the policy loans or the premiums I'm already paying. What should I do with this $100,000? That's going to be the question that the whole point is going to be to answer. I talked to a lot of clients. Some of them have been with us since the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006. Some of them are brand new. And it's such a common occurrence to be operating with IBC and not really understand how to make logical decisions yet. In other words, never really feeling confident that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, or it's confusing. It shouldn't be. So number one, let's talk about this. So in the car loan scenario, if you're going to borrow money from a policy to purchase a vehicle, let's just use that as an example. So you and your spouse purchase vehicles, and you have to purchase vehicles. A vehicle is a depreciating asset, and so we can make some assumptions about you that will help make this logical. So we're going to assume that you are not purchasing your last car that you'll ever own in your entire life from here to the day you die. And so when you purchase a car or any sort of depreciating asset with a policy, it does start to make logical sense to amortize that loan out approximately at least over the lifespan, the projected lifespan of that asset. So if you typically drive a car for 5-6 years before, you wear it out a little bit and you're ready to go find a new one. So you own a car, let's say for 5 years, 60 months. Whenever you borrow money from your policy, it makes sense logically to repay the policy loan on an amortized basis, principal and interest, over the next 60 months. And why would that make sense? Well, it makes sense because you're going to need another car after the end of 5 years. I believe that in your your own personal income statement, your own budget, operating budget, the expense of you driving a car should be there no matter what. And I brought this up a little bit before. Some people, when they are used to paying cash for cars, they say, well, I don't like having a car payment. That's why I pay cash for cars. And it sounds like Nate's telling me to add a car payment that did not used to exist to my life in order to make infinite banking logical. That is incorrect once again. That's a logical fallacy. It does not matter how you finance a car, the expense of financing the car must be accounted for in a budget. It doesn't matter if you lease a car, there's a line item, we're leasing the car. It doesn't matter if you borrow money from a bank, there's a line item, you're paying the bank back over time. Or if you pay cash for cars, there should be a line item. So if you buy a $50,000 car, it's going to wear out and you're going to need another one. If you don't store up the money to pay for the car in the future, you won't be able to buy a car. And then you'll have to borrow money to buy a car, and then you have to make payments to that person. Everyone is making payments on a car because it's a depreciating asset. Money has to be set aside to replace it. Whether you're giving money back to a bank because you borrowed theirs, or whether you're paying cash for it, you got to store money up. Most people don't store up money when they purchase a car with cash, like on a consistent payment-based basis. But how does the money magically appear 5 years later when they need it? Oh, it's because they live on less than they make, and money accumulates, and it just happens to be there because they are frugal and they live on less than they make, and there's money left over, and it stores up in a bank account, and then they pay cash for the car. That's the only way to do this, right? And so IBC is just simply saying, hey, IBC, the policy is the new bank. We've got the money from that system to purchase the car, and we're going to put the money back in that system so we can reuse it. The repayment of the car loan should just be a logical thing. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this guy's 100,000. In our example, if you remember, the question is, well, Nate, what's the logical way to repay, let's say, a loan that you make to an investment? Once again, people, don't overthink the scenario. So let's say we go out and we invested $100,000 and we purchased a piece of property, or maybe we did a real estate syndication, or we did something that's going to produce some cash flow. Remember, we don't have to amortize that loan unless we just wanted to. In other words, we don't have to amortize the loan per se. All we know is that, let's say we put in $100,000 into a deal and it's going to produce $10,000 a year of positive cash flow. We're just making assumptions here, of course, right? The question is, what is the logical thing to do now that you're practicing infinite banking? What is the logical thing to do with the $10,000 of income that investment is now sending to you, and you finance the investment from a policy? What would make sense to do with this cash flow? Don't overcomplicate things. It would just make sense to send the $10,000 back to the policy, because that's our bank. That's what we're banking from. That's our system now. And so we're just saying it makes sense. What if it wasn't going to produce cash flow for 3 or 4 years, and then it was going to be a lump sum payout where maybe you invested $100,000 and you let it sit there and it's going to be paid back a total of $200,000 5 years down the road? How should we repay this policy loan during that time? Well, once again, you can choose to repay it with other cash flow that you may have per se, but the logical thing would be, I'm just going to let the policy loan sit on the sideline and accrue with interest until the investment proceeds come in. Now, you could choose to pay the interest, but it's all based on assumptions that you had cash flow that was available to do that. And you may not. So I'm just saying the logical decision would just simply to be, the $200,000 lump sum that's going to come in 4 or 5 years, and I'm going to pay the policy loan back with interest at that point in time instead of doing it in the interim. And then whatever's left, I'm going to go have some fun with. When your approximate free cash flow, the money that's left over after your lifestyle's lived and taxes are paid and everything, is used to fund premiums, and then we leverage the policy to go do the things of life, whether it's investments or purchasing, house remodels or cars or whatever it is, and then having money flow back in from those sources. And I that was a really quick discussion that if you guys have been listening to my show a lot, I don't need to keep reiterating all of these same things every episode. So go back and re-listen to a few if you want to. But all that to say, we're left with this guy. Everything's based on logic. So he's got $100,000 of premium, makes sense for him. He's saving that much money. It's free cash flow. He's got it working. He's paying back his car loans, but this time it's back to himself as opposed to a bank, or as opposed to paying cash for it and just building money back up in a checking account. He's using a policy to finance him, and he's building that policy back up with cash flow that was already always going to be earmarked for cars no matter what, and there's no illogic towards that. He financed an investment, and he's got $100,000 invested there, and it's producing $10,000 a year of income to him, and he's just flowing that money back in. And he comes to me and he says, I have $100,000 of extra cash that maybe came like from a windfall from an investment that paid off and down the road, or maybe he's had some good years in business or got some big bonuses at work. The question is, what's the most logical thing to do? I think it's logical to take that cash out of the bank, by the way, just to make a quick note of that, and try to get it into his system of policies somehow. But the question is, what's the logical framework we're going to use to decide how to get that money into his system? Herein lies the question. So would it make sense for him to write a $100,000 check to repay a policy loan? Well, that's an option, but then we're left with future decisions we have to make. What are we going to do with this additional cash flow? And once again, we'd like to get into a policy, but if he's maxing out his policy premiums with $100,000 and he's got $100,000 in cash and he's got some policy loans out, what actually will start to make sense is oftentimes that's a good trigger that maybe it's time to expand the system and open another policy, no matter how we skin it. The idea is we have more money now sitting around that we would like to get into the banking system, and the loans we have are already structured to be repaid based on logic. So if I was to pay those off with outside money that was never part of IBC, just note, by the way, if all you did was repay the loans more quickly, you actually haven't changed your future profits inside of the policy system. This is another common misunderstanding. Repaying policy loans or borrowing money to be, taking a policy loan or repaying a policy loan does not speed up the growth of a policy as if it was some sort of magical situation. Once again, this is a dead horse that's been beaten to death in the last 175 episodes of the show. So I don't want to spend a ton of time. The policy grows based on the premiums that you pay. The premiums you pay produce cash value. The cash value earns interest and dividends. You are allowed to leverage the cash value with a policy loan And the terms of that loan are amazing to you. It's the only place in the world that offers an interest-only line of credit for life. So it offers you an interest-only line of credit for life, and that's a very, very powerful financial tool. It doesn't get enough credit, in general. But once again, these have been beat to death.
The conventional financial system makes the bank rich using your money and pays you next to nothing in return. At Living Wealth, we believe in challenging the status quo. After all, most of those conventional tools only seem to make someone else rich. Let us show you how to become your own bank. Visit livingwealth.com/bank on yourself. You'll receive instant access to what we call the beginner's course. This free, in-depth, easy-to-follow course teaches people how to create and profit from infinite banking. We not only discuss the philosophy and principles behind infinite banking, but also offer real-life examples to demonstrate how it works. Even participants experienced with infinite banking often tell us how they learned a ton too. It's worthwhile regardless of your experience level. Stop letting the banks and Wall Street dictate your financial future. Again, that's livingwealth.com/bank on yourself to gain access to the free course today. Now back to Nate and Holly.
That's one option, but we're just kicking the can down the road. That's all we're going to do. In other words, once those loans are paid back more quickly, he's going to have the cash flow from the investment still coming in. He's going to have the cash flow that was normally set aside for car payments that he has the ability to do. And now he doesn't have any loan balances to put it back into. And so it makes logical sense to start a new policy. That's what the roads start to lead to. And it shouldn't be a surprise that that's what it is. It just simply means, hey, my system is not quite big enough yet to handle all the money that's been coming in. But that's why I believe that starting new policy should be logical. The question is, why do people find themselves in this situation so often, and they have capital that does not come into their system, though they want it to be in there, really. They'd like it to be in there, but we'll talk to people that'll have hundreds of thousands of dollars, like business owners especially, will have hundreds of thousands of dollars in bank accounts and their corporation and personal things. And they have policies and they're paying good premiums and they're borrowing policies to help run their operation and they're doing IBC, but some logical things start to break down. In other words, they'll have a whole bunch of cash in the bank and it won't be in their policies. And they know that's where they want it to be, but they're confused as to how to get it there. And so, there'll be the same type of scenario where someone will have $100,000 of cash sitting around. What should I do? Well, you should probably use that money to capitalize a new policy. Why don't they? Why is it kind of a concern sometimes? It all goes back to another thing, another dead horse that lays in the road that I beat to death many, many times. And I have to keep bringing it up because the most common issue that plagues the logic of the system is that many people don't start new policies because of fear of premium. That's what it all boils down to. Afraid to capitalize. That's what Nelson Nash used to say all the time. In fact, he wrote in his book, Becoming Your Own Banker. Nelson Nash, by the way, wrote the book, Becoming Your Own Banker. If you haven't read it, you should. There's really two main rules to doing IBC. The first rule, the main rule, is don't be afraid to capitalize. Don't be afraid to capitalize policies. Don't be afraid of premium. And I have done in shows in the past and in the 4 Stages webinar, which I've alluded to many times, the idea that what keeps people from really making logical decisions in IBC is normally emotional feelings about fears that most of the time are based on misunderstandings on especially premium and policy flexibility. So this is one of the things that we run into all the time. If your premiums are too low because you're afraid to pay premiums, then you will always have cash accumulating outside of policies, and there was no way to get those into policies except for to expand, but you're afraid to, so you won't. But that means that now everything starts to break down. The logic of the entire system starts to break down because now the question is, well, when should I ever take a policy loan out? Oftentimes it doesn't make sense to take policy loans out if you have a whole bunch of cash sitting on the sidelines. Why would you borrow money from a policy and pay policy loan interest to the policy just to end up having a checking account flush with cash at the end of the day? And I talked about this in the last episode as well. The way to overcome it is to use it, but maybe you have to power through some of this. Whenever you have lower levels of premium than you should go ahead and use the policies to finance things that IBC should be financing so that you can overcome some of this and get to the point where every decision can be logical. How do I know when to start another policy? Well, if I get to the end of the year and I'm repaying my policy loans and I'm paying my policy premiums and there's still money left over, that's a neon dollars and nonsense behind the shot sign. That's a neon sign that says it's probably time for Nate to start a new policy. How big should it be? Well, how much money's left over? And some people say, well, how do I know if money's not going to be left over the same next month or next year, and how do I plan this? The last thing I want to bring up is, okay, how do I handle volatile income and how do I make the system flexible in that way? But it reminds me, some of this, the logic breaking down idea reminds me of the people who start in the IBC world with like a singular objective in mind. So let's say someone starts a policy and they want to fund real estate investments with it. So they're like, hey, I'm already going to do real estate, and I've looked into this whole infinite banking thing. Seems like a great place to like put capital into and then leverage it out to go purchase real estate, just cycle money in and out of the policy. I think that's going to sound great. I want to do it. The problem is, if you're only doing IBC as a means to a singular end, I'm only going to do this one thing with it, you run into this issue where things in your life that you should be doing that are logical, you might not end up doing because you didn't see IBC as doing those things. You'll end up having money set aside in cash to do things, and like you'll be setting money aside maybe to go remodel the house, and you have this big policy loan that you could just be putting that money back towards the policy loan at the very least, and then use the policy to fund it, but it doesn't fit the box that it's in. This is why Nelson Nash called this infinite banking, is because we don't suggest you put this thing in a box. So the logic can start to break down when you don't see infinite banking when you get started as a comprehensive, brand new banking system. If that's how you see it, then everything can become logical from there. The decisions can be actually relatively easy to make. I did an episode a few months ago on a Wall Street Journal article describing the billions and billions of dollars that Americans are missing out on simply by doing business with the wrong banks. So I ran a quick calculation just for this show again, and it's like if someone had $200,000 in the bank and they were banking at Bank of America, which was paying like 0% on their savings accounts, and let's say Ally Bank or something like that was paying 3% on a savings account. The reason why people didn't make the change to a better bank, even though it's relatively logical thing to do just to make more money, was because of convenience. They're just like, well, I've already been banking here for so long, I got a relationship here. And I understand that, and I'm fine with that. I'm just saying, if you run a quick calculation, let's say the guy's 50 years old, he's got $200,000 in reserves in the bank, earning 0, and he could just switch it over to something else earning 3%. That $200,000, if he's 50, would grow to $562,000 after 35 years has gone by. So let's say he dies at age 85. That means in his lifetime, he missed out on $362,000. That's a pretty steep price to pay for convenience for a lot of us, to be honest with you. So along those same lines, what I'm trying to bring up is things are supposed to be logical. Like, in other words, if you can make more money by practicing IBC in more areas of your life, then it should just make sense to do so, because almost everything in other words, all IBC is dealing with is cash flow that exists in your life anyway. And so the cash flow that's coming in, whether you're paying premiums with it or whether you're paying loans back with it, these things should become logical. And I can help you, if you're a client of mine, I can help you see the logic. Or at least that's my goal, to help you see the logic, to learn how this whole thing operates. Let's go out and say one last thing. In the last episode, or at least maybe it was 2 episodes ago, I talked about strategic loan balances as well. This is why I really like the idea of having a strategic loan balance. One of the reasons why I like the idea of having strategic loan balances is because it allows you to operate inside of IBC even more logically than ever before. And it can help alleviate fear of premium from your life. Just the simple idea of having a strategic loan balance. So you could have the same hypothetical situation. The idea of the strategic loan balance, though, would be, let's say that he had borrowed some money out of his policy to pay his tax bill every year. And let's say it was $50,000 a year of taxes. And he was doing so with the intent of creating a strategic loan balance. So not having to pay tax out of his cash flow frees up that $50,000 a year of taxes that he had been paying, and he decided to go open up a new policy with it, let's say. So he's actually not paying $100,000 of premium. Now he would be paying $150,000 of premium. But he hasn't changed his cash flow at all. In other words, he's just simply saying the $50,000 of tax cash flow that I used to pay directly to the IRS, I'm going to borrow that from my pool of policies, so I don't have to send my $50,000 to the IRS. Now I can put it into a policy premium. Now I'm going to have a policy loan accumulating inside of the system, but I'm doing it on purpose because I want a place to store random amounts of money. So now you can actually create this system to where it can hold money at any given moment in time in a much more flexible manner without dealing with any MEC limits or anything of that sort. So if you have a strategic loan balance, the idea is that anytime excess cash comes in, whether you have a good year, whether you get a bonus, whether you receive an investment windfall, whether you receive an inheritance, all of these types of things will come in over the next 10, 20 years. If you are operating with a strategic loan balance in place, you don't actually have to start a new policy every time you get a windfall in order to make logical sense. You can just dump the money in to repay a chunk of the strategic loan balance. But here's what I'm trying to bring up. Those other loans that he had were not strategic loan balances. That's the idea. So you have to do this in order for this system to make sense. Everything has to be logical. His car loans are not strategic loan balances. They don't fit the same criteria because he's got cash flow to repay those. A strategic loan balance is something that's built with the sole purpose of allowing you to expand your system to operate with more premiums than you otherwise would, be willing to commit to out of cash flow, which then frees you up to be able to contribute random amounts of money in a very logical way without having to start a new policy every time. So this is why I like the idea of carrying a strategic loan balance to some degree. You don't need to go crazy with it. You want a coach to help you with it, but it helps really simplify decision-making when you operate with a strategic loan balance type of situation. Because then, anytime excess cash comes in, you already have a place to put it. Your strategic loan balance. You built it to hold it. It's all part of the plan. So now you can live your life and operate IBC with a little bit more effectiveness and logic behind the situation, understanding what to do in every situation. A lot of times people don't, they run, their logical scenario runs out because of emotional issues like fear of premium and different things, which I'm just here to help. It's perfectly fine. I'm not judging anything about that. It's just all of us have had it, and we've either powered through it and we've figured out what life is like on the other side, or we haven't. And that's who we are. And so it took me a little while to get over it as well, just like everybody. But all that to be said, the idea of a strategic loan balance can also help alleviate concerns of getting overextended with policies. Well, just knowing that you can create a strategic loan balance can help you expand the system and open up more opportunities for profit inside of policies without any sort of concern, because, hey, this guy could just move forward and put in $100,000 a year out of cash flow and take the $50,000 a year of tax amount of money that he was going to pay anyway. It's already part of his cash flow. In other words, he could actually transition to paying $150,000 of premium without changing his cash flow, which now allows him to stuff money back in to repay the accumulated loan balance. Maybe we do it for 4 or 5 year build out. And then on top of that, it allows him to have a MEC limit of $150,000, which he can max out with a higher amounts of policy premium into the future. Once again, go back and listen to the strategic loan balance episode. What I'm trying to bring up is that it can be logical to create one of those if it's likely that you'll have windfalls that your system won't be able to fit unless we create it. So the people who have volatile incomes, who are in business, who can have good years or down years, the people who expect inheritance or maybe a sale of their business, or they have investments already that are probably going to pay out in times in the future, it can make sense to build your system that has a strategic loan balance. It'll help everything become more logical. If you are appreciating these episodes, I think the world should hear about them. I'm very passionate about it. I think these are great. I think this information needs to be known in the IBC world at large. The best way to do that to help us out would be to rate, review, subscribe on YouTube, just to throw us a bone, because that's what the algorithms love. And so we'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't mind liking, rating, subscribing. Such a pleasure to do this. Such a privilege that you listened. We're very thankful for it. This has been Dollars and Nonsense. If you follow the herd, you will get slaughtered.
One last thing before we go. Start your journey towards financial security and wealth today. Visit livingwealth.com. livingwealth.com/bank on yourself. Upon completing the course, you'll have all the information you'll need to see if infinite banking is right for you. Again, go to livingwealth.com/bank on yourself.